when we get kind of pigeonholed in the precise narrative of what it is we're supposed to be doing as science and religion people or whatever, that often we lose track of the fact that there's some kid who might be, a poetry major, but for whom actually science and religion could be a really interesting entree into how they're thinking about poetry, whether that's in a comparative cultural domain or a specific culture or whatever, right? Or just even in modes of knowledge and that kind of thing. So we actually are relevant to almost every student on campus.
Welcome back to the ISSR YouTube channel. Today's In Conversation is a little bit different. I'm going to be leading the conversation with Robert Geraci, who is the Knight Distinguished Chair for the Study of Religion and Culture and Professor of Religious Studies at Knox College. So you've got your PhD and your MA both from University of California, Santa Barbara, and a BA in liberal arts at the University of Texas, Austin. Now, my understanding is that Knox College is itself a liberal arts college. Is that correct?
It is, and we have, just to say lovely things about my colleagues, we have an
Yeah, please.
incredible diversity of education that goes from a gorgeous art building on one side to a science building and urban farm on the other side. I mean, the educational opportunities are really across the intellectual spectrum, and our students are like that too. They often, everybody's got an and, I'm a physics major and I'm into painting, or something like that.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
it's a
Yeah, that's
fun, it is a proper liberal arts kind of education that we offer at Knox.
and it's about like it's pretty small, right? Like it's an under 2,000 student kind
That's
of
correct.
institution. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
usually
that gives
usually
you a
around
lot of
1,200 students.
Yeah, so that gives you a lot of one-on-one time with students. Like you probably have small classes, I'm guessing, of around no more than 20-ish.
Yeah, I think I had one class a little over 20, but most of my classes are 10 to 15.
Yeah, that must be extremely nice. I've been in classes and I've taught classes that are hundreds, and it's never that's that's not really a fun scenario to be in. But remind me, you were at somewhere in Manhattan, correct, before? This
Yeah,
is a relatively recent move.
that's correct. I was at Manhattan College, now Manhattan University. They rebranded. But
Okay.
that it's actually not in Manhattan, it's in the Bronx for those who know their New York geography. But I was at Manhattan for 19 years before
19
deciding
years.
that
Okay, interesting.
change of
And
scenery was desired.
okay, so this was a move that you were actively looking for?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so what is the process like for academics? Because most academics, to my understanding, and I could be wrong here, but most academics tend to move a little quite a bit actually at the like early career and then
Mm.
kind of settle and stay. So what 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 is your take on transitioning like later in your career kind of at your peak, you have books coming out and you're established. What is that transition like?
Yeah, it definitely winnows down the number of opportunities as you move along, uh, in part because people don't really necessarily want to hire a senior person with tenure that if you end up hating them, what are you going to do about it afterwards, right? So most institutions are more inclined, and most departments are more inclined to hire junior people that they can kind of raise up into the culture of their departments and their institutions for better or for worse. Um, in my case, one of the things Knox happened to be kind of looking for at the time was some senior leadership, but also the endowed chair position um, doesn't
Right.
necessitate that. Sometimes you hire someone at a junior level and then you kind of raise them up through the ranks, but it enabled and allowed that. Um, Moving at a senior level is definitely an interesting thing, right? Because when you spent 20 years somewhere, you know everybody, everybody
Yeah.
knows you.
Yeah.
And when, for example, you want to try something new, in my case, I had the kind of social cachet that said, this is what I want to try. And people go, oh, well, Geraci's all right. He's been doing things for a long time around here. And when you come to a new place, you don't have the automatic, oh, he can be trusted, right? And so
Yes.
that's an
Right.
interesting change for me in developing relationships with my colleagues, that I'm developing them in a very, very different kind of way. And on the other hand, I'm also tenured and stuff. So I don't have any of the kind of tenuous, fearful, if I was in my second year, you're worried about who you might offend because you don't know if that's going to come back to bite you. And in my case, I
Yeah.
don't have to have those worries. I just want good collaborators to bring things together. And that means, hey, this is who I am. And here's why I think this is a good idea for us to do together. And so it's definitely a different experience to be at a different, to have moved at this point in my career.
Yeah, interesting.
So
One thing that
uh,
I always think about, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to just point out one thing I like
Yeah,
whenever
please.
professional stuff comes up, and I should have said, we're all, playing. If you've got an academic job, a tenure track job, you've already kind of like, it's like getting into the major leagues in baseball. It's a hard gig, right? And we
Yeah.
need to find ways to expand those options for people, expand those opportunities, especially for our junior colleagues, to create more jobs and more potential there, right? But all of us should be grateful, and I am deeply grateful for the position I have because there's so much luck in that process. It's not just hard work. There's lots of luck, and I'm grateful that a few things have fallen my way over the years.
Is Knox College a private institution or is it publicly funded?
No, it's a private school. It was founded along with the town of Galesburg. They were founded in 1836 by Congregationalists and another Christian group, and I can't remember, maybe Presbyterians. They were
Okay.
abolitionists, and they came out to the Midwest and they founded this town and this college. And actually, we've had an incredible kind of record. Abraham Lincoln, before he became the president, gave was our very first honorary doctorate. But he
Oh, wow.
also the fifth and most important Lincoln Douglas debate, which is the one where Lincoln publicly came out against slavery for the first time, happened on our campus. And so you can come and visit
Oh,
that site. And
incredible.
so we have a long and really treasured history as a private institution, originally religious, but I don't know at what point the religious side dropped away. We're an entirely secular institution at this point, but still a
Okay.
private school with a demonstrable commitment to how are we contributing to a better world, which is pretty awesome to be a part of also.
I think I read that Knox played a key role also in the Underground Railroad.
So
Um,
Galesburg definitely did. This was a
okay.
town that unquestionably was part of the Underground Railroad and settling people who got to Illinois and then helping them move further north, wherever they might be heading. And I don't know a ton about this history. I just know that some of the buildings that aren't here anymore definitely were part of that, like a church that burned down and has been
Yeah, sure.
subsequently replaced by a newer church, so the town has that history. I'm not sure what the college's own participation in that process might have been. That would be a thing to go to. We do have an extensive archive,
Mm.
and special collections, which would probably be the place to look for that. But we also have lots of other cool stuff in our special collections. When I taught Galileo, I got to teach the Galileo affair with one of 12 existing first edition copies of the dialogue concerning the two chief world systems. I
Oh,
mean,
wow.
from 1632, right? Like who has that
Yeah,
opportunity when you're teaching
incredible.
religion and science
Yeah,
to do that kind of
absolutely.
thing? And the
Wow, that
guy
is
who wrote,
amazing.
yeah, the guy who wrote the textbook for that John Scopes was using in the
Mm.
1920s leading up to the Scopes trial. That guy was a Knox professor. So we have a
Oh,
copy of
interesting.
his early textbook, the one that was at stake, and the 1926 version where evolution's been removed from the textbook. So we really have actually not just an interesting archive and special collections in general, but for me as a religion and science person, we have some really interesting stuff. And when I taught the Galileo Fair, the archives folks, they got all the Galileo works out. And we got to have
Incredible.
those there present as part of the work. And we also had the 100 Civic Biology and a first edition of Darwin's descent of man, like right when we
Oh,
did when
wow.
we started teaching evolution. So I get to do lots of really pretty fun things, and that's super exciting, right? And I've only been here now less than 2 years, so there's still lots for me to keep exploring and seeing how it can affect my teaching and allow me to give my students new cool opportunities.
So, given that this is a private institution that seems to be very much focused in that liberal arts sphere of engagement with students and these kinds of like really interesting small collections that you wouldn't expect, can you speak to the difference between a private institution and a public institution?
Yeah,
Um, just because here in Canada, at least, the public-private distinction is a bit more pronounced. Public institutions are most of the major university institutions, and the private ones are for profit and often less reputable here in Canada. But in the United States, obviously, the private universities are some of the most reputable. But
yeah,
what are the main differences here for someone who's on the
yeah.
outside?
I saw that sort of distinction for the first time when I was living in India. And that
Okay.
whole the private schools are these kind of weird, some private schools in India now have a reputation that's more sturdy, but at the time I was quite surprised because here in the US, as you noted, some of our most prestigious schools, right? You go look at the Ivy League schools, the University of Chicago, all these private schools. I am a faculty brat. I grew up on the campus of the University of Texas. And
Oh, okay.
so from, when I was a toddler onwards, I was hanging out at public universities. All my degrees came from public universities. The biggest difference really is in kind of average class size. As you noted, sometimes in university settings, you might have 100, 200, even 800 students in a class. And that just changes what can be done in that class, right? And changes the
Yeah.
relationship you can have with a student.
Yeah.
So, where I am, I'm going to teach a class on religion and artificial intelligence this coming spring term. We're on a quarter system. So, we're just about to start our new quarter. And I'm only going to have 10 students in there. What I can give to a student when I've only got 10 is a
Yeah.
really
Wow.
big difference from what I can give to a student if I have 30, 40, or 400. And that's not to say I didn't have some amazing lecturers when I was at the University of Texas. I had some stunning people. I saw some people who delivered fabulously for a class of 400 when I was a graduate student at UC Santa Barbara. I saw people who were amazing at that. But the personal touch of the liberal arts college is really in many respects where we shine in the US. We do have for-profit private schools. But the vast majority of what you see in the United States that's a private school is not for profit, just the same way as the public schools are. The difference is we're not getting money from the state government. And because we're not getting money from the state government, and we're offering things like smaller classes, typically the sticker price goes up. But there's a lot of, here at Knox, we actually offer, if I am not mistaken, if you're an Illinois resident or you come from a Native American tribe historically associated with Illinois, or you come from a family with less than $100,000 of total family income, I'm pretty sure we're tuition free. And then we
Oh,
figure
wow.
it out.
Okay.
Right? Like we figure out how to get you your education, so and I don't think we're entirely unique in that. We might have a better than average capacity to do that for a small college. We're not super, super rich the way some schools are. But we really work very hard to try to find that affordability factor for our students and often succeed in creating opportunity where it might not otherwise exist. And a kid who comes in and gets to be in classes with 15 people at a time, if they're committed to their own education, they come out really well ahead. It's really a great thing.
Yeah. So what I've noticed looking at some of these liberal arts colleges in the US is that they seem to punch far above their weight on notable alumni. A lot of them are high-hitting academics, government officials in various capacities, Nobel laureates, Rhodes Scholars. Like it seemed, and a lot of them feed into high-ranking graduate programs across the country and across the world. So I think you're absolutely right there that that close and more intimate experience definitely can correlate with
I
strong
I
performance.
think out of our last graduating class, we had three students go to the Iowa Writers Workshop. And for people who are into creative writing, the Iowa Writers Work, it's literally without peer. And
Wow.
we had three students who just graduated who are in the this year's, incoming class there. So we definitely, I mean, there's so many ways in which the institution punches above its weight, both in terms of how big we are and our endowment. We don't have $1 billion endowment, right? Which obviously changes the dynamics. If
Yeah,
you have
sure.
if you have 2,000 students or 1,200 students and you have $1 billion, that changes certain factors of the way education works. Um, but nevertheless, I think we do some pretty amazing work, and I think a lot of liberal arts colleges here in America are doing similar kinds of things that are really working for our students and really giving people a lot of opportunity. And to someone like yourself who's like looking at what does the job market kind of look like? I remember 20 years ago, we all thought we wanted R1 jobs. Everybody wanted these, and shortly
Sure.
after I got a job at the liberal arts college I worked in for 19 years, I remember sitting at the American Academy of Religion annual conference, and I overheard a couple of graduate students, and they were saying things like, well, I might take a job at a liberal arts college, but I'd work for it for a couple of years, and then I'd go get a job at an R1. And I mean, I was laughing inside because part of me is like, look, you're going to take a job where you can get a job.
Yeah.
Because there
Yeah.
aren't enough jobs, out there. And so you should kind of be grateful for the opportunities afforded. But second of all, you just don't even understand because you're kind of R1 educated and your graduate advisors might be telling you R1, 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 it's the only place you can do research. And I do think my own career shows that you can do research without being at an R1.
Yeah.
Uh, and there's just some really amazing opportunities at these little liberal arts colleges to both do your research work, but also really connect with students in ways that, as you say, then they end up Rhodes Scholars or Nobel laureates or whatever they end up doing,
Yeah.
or
Incredible.
they become high-ranking politicians or something else. And so you get that kind of privilege and pride also in your students.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting the whole dynamic and that I've been witnessing over the past number of years as both a graduate student myself, but someone who deals with scholars all over the world in my role here. And I think one thing that really stands out to me that you just said is that the push in graduate school is for that R1, but I think that on the one hand, you just don't have enough jobs. So it's like you got to tone down your expectations a little bit. But at this the other side of that, I think, is that you can do really meaningful and engaging work regardless of where you are if you care enough. So I like what you said there.
Yeah, when I get a chance to talk to people who are at the PhD level, I do encourage them to kind of rethink those expectations that their advisors, everybody's trying to replicate the exact same model. But at least here in America, the reality is there are a lot more small colleges than there are R1s. And if you're willing to find your path at a small college, there are a lot of really terrific opportunities here in Galesburg, where Knox is, one of those terrific opportunities is also affordable housing. And
Yeah.
that's not to be left at in this day and age.
No.
That yes, we're in a small town, and that comes with certain kinds of losses and sacrifices, right? But there are
Mhm.
other wins involved in that. And yes, there are things that when you're in a small college that you don't get that you would get if you were at an R1, huge kind of research infrastructure and whatever else. But there are also opportunities that don't exist at those places. And it's really important to find those and really get involved in the place where you are. And so I do like to tell people when they're at the PhD stage, like, try to put those prejudices aside, right? That's a totally arbitrary prejudice that you'll be happier at an R1. You don't know that. For many
Yeah.
people, an R1 really isn't the right place. And I've been really content, teaching in liberal arts colleges. My previous institution was a Catholic liberal arts college that never had more than about 3,300 students. So it's bigger than
Okay.
Knox, but it's not R1 or even second tier state school size or anything like that. And I've enjoyed being at those small colleges and the relationships and opportunities that I've been able to develop at them.
Excellent. That's really great. So moving slightly, keeping the thread, but moving slightly, what's it like teaching science and religion? Actually, no, first what is your view of science and religion as an educator? Let's go
Uh,
big.
I think one of the great things is we're kind of relevant to everybody. I think there's so much opportunity for students kind of across the intellectual spectrum to get involved and to think, oh, there's a piece of that that matters for me. And so that's a really great opportunity
Mm,
that we have in our field of science and religion. And that when we get kind of pigeonholed in the precise narrative of what it is we're supposed to be doing as science and religion people or whatever, that often we lose track of the fact that there's some kid who might be, a poetry major but for whom actually science and religion could be a really interesting entree into how they're thinking about poetry, whether that's in a comparative cultural domain or a specific culture or whatever, right? Or just even in modes of knowledge and that kind of thing. So we actually are relevant to almost every student on campus. I had a theater student in my religion and science class this past winter whose final project he wanted to connect it to theater. So he wanted to talk about is so his conceit for the whole thing was Deus ex machina. And the idea that in theater, you just have this kind of magical solution to the problem that's been happening. And he then made his entire project about how people see either religion or science as a kind of deus ex machina that just solves all their problems for them. I mean, it was fabulous, right?
mm,
So this student who's really a theater major and loves his theater was able to see our discipline as one that kind of mattered for him. And the more we open the discipline and say, and this is, kind of a personal axe to grind in our discipline, we were so unhappy with the conflict narrative that we were like, okay, so there's harmony too. And then we weren't happy with the conflict harmony axis. And so we invented typologies that went from, Barber's 4 things in the typology to some people had 8 or 12 things in the typology, just like typology on. We probably needed typologies for the typologies, right? And it was all about kind of how
yeah.
to classify these things. And so I wrote this paper a few years ago, and one of the peer reviewers rightly criticized that it was like more of a manifesto than a method. But where I was trying to point out that all these things that people saw as methodologically pertinent, it was in the journal Zygon, which has done such great work for our field over the last 50 years, right? Just
Yeah,
amazing
absolutely.
what they have contributed to academia over 50 years. And they published this paper that I wrote about how science, technology, and religion are like a hydra with different heads and they kind of stomp around. And sometimes the heads are going in the same direction, sometimes they're going in different directions, who knows, right? But there's no simple way to kind of classify what's going on.
Yeah.
And I think if we give up on how tightly we want to classify stuff, we open the door to those students who are theater students who are going, well, how am I going to see religion and science as pertinent to my worldview, my intellectual universe, right? And we can do that for those students, but not if we're just hammering home you can be religion X and you can be science B, right? Like if we're hammering that over and over and over again, all the student will hear is that and not how do I connect this to my life as a painter, as a theater major, as an economist, right? And I think these are all functionally open doors for our students. And I think that's really cool. I'm really grateful that what our discipline does is open those kinds of doors.
Yeah, absolutely. I, I, on that, I've noticed two things that stand out to me. One is that science and religion, having focused um, my specialist exams on the field of science and religion, I've noticed the transition from very strict boundaries to much looser boundaries over the course of the past 20, 40 years, in that range. And then the second thing is that how you described your student and the theater project, I've noticed that a lot of younger scholars, early career scholars, are looking at science and religion in interesting ways. So, small shout out to Donovan Schaefer at University of Pennsylvania. He talks about science and religion as affects, which I find really interesting. You know, like not the traditional here's our religion and here's a science, as you said, but these are kind of like the felt and embodied emotions that we get from them. But also just the scope too. You mentioned you lived in India, and I would like to get to that, but there's a lot of work happening on in science and religion in India and the Islamic world, like Shah Malik at Edinburgh. Like these are, it's really grown not only in terms of the disciplinary boundaries and the field is expanded as a result of that, but also the geographic boundaries, which is really changing, I think, a lot of what we're seeing. So speaking of that, your time in India, how did that shape, how did that come about, and how did that shape your view on science and religion? Because it's so at its core, it's so different. The worldview and the construction of that worldview come from such different playing fields. So how did that inform how you see science and religion?
So part of it, if we go kind of like back in time, is before I ever went to India, and I don't mean this as kind of a assault on any prior scholarship, because the fact is we start in one place and that becomes the building blocks for the next place, right?
Yes, yes.
And as an example, for example, you mentioned the Islamic world. There was a point in the early 21st century where I was looking, I had this kind of project that I was thinking I might involve some other people in, and I went looking for someone who had something to do with digital technology and Islam. And I found this guy, Gary
Okay.
Blunt. I think he's in the UK, does good work, and he was the only guy. Right? It was like he was the guy. And but now, if you want to look at even narrow domains, you're going, okay, I want someone who does AI and Islam. There are some really fabulous people who are kind of leading that. I'm thinking immediately Yakub Chaudhry comes to mind, but there are a
Mm,
number of other people who are doing really cool work there. But 20 years ago, there was one guy, right? And if you went 25 years ago, there's probably zero people, right? And so
right. Yeah.
we're really developing that. But what happened was way back in, I don't know, 2012 or something like that. I was finishing my second book, which was about video games and virtual worlds. And I thought, I really don't think there's enough good work about what happens in other countries. There's some good work, but there's not enough good work. And in many cases, it's very much that paradigm I don't like of in country X, they either have harmony between religion and science or they have conflict. And it's just too, I just don't love it. And that, by the way,
Yeah.
that's not to mean there aren't some really influential and worthwhile ways of trying to classify these things. There have been some great work in that, including that original everybody picks on him or adores him Ian Barber work, right? That was critical for us as a field, absolutely critical, right?
Yeah.
Even though I
Yeah.
don't want to use it. um, but so in 2012 or whatever, when I was finishing Virtually Sacred, I was thinking I should do something in a different country. But being an American and not just an American from Texas, that means I barely speak English and I'm useless if you want to send me to like a foreign country. So I needed to go somewhere where they would speak English well enough that I could actually interview people and talk to people. And the best scenario for me was India because there were a lot, first of all, I had done work, including a little bit of Sanskrit when I was an undergraduate. So I knew a fair bit, as an amateur scholar in the world of Indian religion, philosophy, and history, because I had done some undergraduate work there, but I had not done graduate work in it, and I hadn't been at it in a long while. And fortunately, some really graceful people were willing to write letters of recommendation for me saying, yeah, it's maybe not exactly his field, but we think he can kind of do this. And the Fulbright Association was kind enough, and it's when you go to India, it's a Fulbright Nehru because the Indian government pays 50% of the Fulbright. It's the only country in all of the world that covers 50% of a Fulbright. And so it's a
Wow.
Fulbright Nehru Award. And they were gracious enough to give me that award, let me come to India, go to the most prestigious science institution in India, the Indian Institute of Science. There's a professor there of biology, Raghavendra Gadagkar, and he was kind enough to let me come and be part of this thing he had created, the Center for Contemporary Studies. And so I got to interview scientists and engineers. And because I was at ISC, it meant if I sent an email to someone in a tech company, because this is all in Bangalore, which is the tech hub of India. And so there are all these tech companies, both indigenous like Wipro and whatever, and Microsoft is there and everyone else. So if I sent an email, I was coming from ISC. Hi, I'm a visiting scholar at ISC. And they all know ISC, and that helps open some doors. So I was very, very fortunate. And it began with this idea that the work about um, India, religion and science in India just wasn't what I wanted, right? There was a long history of a couple of folks writing perfectly decent things about physics and Hindu philosophy and cosmology. Fine. It just wasn't what I was interested in was in what actual people do and what actual people think. And so I
Yeah.
got to go there, and for the first Fulbright Nehru, I was there just interviewing scientists and engineers, and that produced the book Temples of Modernity. And then the second time I was there, I still haven't written the book on that one. I got distracted. I was actually doing research on handloom weaving. And so I was
Oh,
interviewing weavers and entrepreneurs in the weaving universe. And
interesting.
and I still want to do all that work. But while I was there, I started writing kind of a sequel to my very first book, Apocalyptic AI, that was kind of a like apocalyptic AI when it comes to India. So I wrote
Right.
this sequel and I published it right before ChatGPT came out. And so ChatGPT came
Okay.
out, and then everything was about AI. And so I haven't really been able to get back because nobody really wants to talk to me about weaving. I'm just kind of interested in weaving. But I am going to get back to it because I still think there's a lot to be said about handcraft and the intellectual value of handcraft, but also the social and environmental value of handcraft. And so I want to go back to those questions, which I think also we in the world of religion and science, people are real worked up about, Big Bang cosmology, and they're real worked up about can you believe in quantum dynamics and the free action of God or whatever, whatever it is.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but real people, everyday people, have choices about what kind of clothing they're going to wear, and what kind of blanket they're going to use. And we in the field of religion, science, technology have not at all really thought about where those kind of handcrafted things come into the picture and how we ought to be talking about them. So at some point, I hope to make a meaningful contribution to that domain. I got a bunch of data. I wrote about 40% of a book. But then I got hung up on a different book project. And so I just keep getting hung up. But I do plan on getting back to that. And I would love to see more scholars do it. I am thrilled that, as you noted, there's a lot more scholars doing work abroad. I wish we had better funding mechanisms to bring people from abroad to the United States. I would like
Yes.
to hear more about what people from foreign cultures think about Americans. This kind of asymmetry of research that says from Europe and America, Europe, North America, you go places or whatever, you learn things. Well, and then you talk about those people or whatever. I'd like to correct that symmetry, that asymmetry. I would like it so that people came from what does an Estonian person think when, you know, when they
Yeah.
come in
Yeah.
and deal with everyday average New Yorkers or whatever, or everyday average rural Illinois people? I think there's a lot of room for that. And we need to think about how our institutions could fund those kinds of opportunities so that it becomes symmetrical or at least more than it is. But there are a lot of people trying to do fun stuff. And I actually think it's really fun. I love it when someone comes up to me with a kind of crazy idea about what they're doing. I'm delighted. I'm like, that sounds really fun. You should totally go pursue that, you know?
Yeah. Awesome. So let's tap into that AI point because you've been talking about AI for a while. Your first book from Oxford University Press was Apocalyptic AI: Visions of Heaven in Robotics and Artificial Intelligence, I believe, right?
Yeah,
And
and virtual reality.
and virtual reality, and that was 2010.
Yeah.
So you've been talking about AI before AI was being talked about at this scale, right? So I take us through your thoughts going into that. Like what inspired thinking about um AI and religion, but then I would like the second half of that question is what have you seen play out
Yeah. Yeah.
that reflect back on and say, wow, I got that right, or wow, I got that wrong.
Super lucky, right? You know, way back when I was writing, and do you know what the very coolest alternative rock band of the 1990s was? It was Soul Coughing. Soul
Okay,
Coughing, a New York band. So if you don't know your Soul
I'll look it
Coughing,
up.
people out there, go look them up. They in
Okay.
fact recently reunited for a tour. And when they broke up in the year 2000, their frontman had a kind of solo career, and he was joking about robots in some like we'd seen him live, or maybe I had a recording, like a bootleg recording. I don't know. He's joking about robots or whatever, and that probably affected me because when I had to write my dissertation in 2004, 2005, whatever it was, I got my degree in '05, so it must have been in about '04. I needed I wanted to write about religion, science, and art. And that meant I needed a religion and I needed a science and I needed some contemporary artists. And for the science side of that, I thought, well, robots are cool. Everybody likes robots. And that was literally the kind of arbitrary decision. So, and I will say that I really like things like math and science. When I was getting my PhD, I thought about getting an undergraduate degree in math while I was there, and I started taking
Mhm.
math classes. But for a variety of reasons, I didn't continue that path. Um, but when I started thinking, all right, robots are my science, I learned a little bit about programming robots, enough to make a robot follow a black line on a, floor or whatever, which, by
Okay.
the way, is harder than you'd think.
Yeah,
Even though,
yeah,
contemporary with the kind of algorithms that can fly a drone around right now were unimaginable 25 years
yeah,
ago. Nobody was close
yeah.
to that. So I learned a tiny bit about programming, and it wasn't because I wanted to be a roboticist. It was just I wanted to have a feel for the sort of problematic nature, right? What are the things someone stumbles into if they're trying to do something really hard, right? If it's challenging enough for me to make a Lego robot follow a black line, like what does it mean to get a humanoid robot and make it dance? Like Sony was doing with the
Yeah.
Stereo robot shortly after that. So some arbitrary good luck. And then I started reading the things that roboticists wrote, people like Hans Moravec and Ray Kurzweil. And I literally was reading Hans Moravec going, I'm getting a PhD in religious studies. And this is the most religious thing I've read in years. Because it was all about
Interesting.
mind uploading and godlike robotic intelligence and resurrecting the dead. And I thought to myself, that's as religious as it gets. And it doesn't matter whether it's Moore's law that you use to justify your claim or whether you use, the book of Revelation to justify your claim. You're projecting to the future this fantastical world of human transcendence that doesn't have automatic and clear empirical verification associated with it, right? So there was something very religious about what these really brilliant people in robotics and AI were doing. And so I read a bunch of stuff and wrote about that in my dissertation, just one chapter. And when I finished my PhD, and I guess this is another lesson perhaps for people who are finishing PhDs, I thought my dissertation will take more work to turn into a quality book than it would be to take that one chapter and turn it into a quality book, or at least what I hope was,
Oh, interesting. Okay.
right? And so I took that one chapter, and over the next couple of years, I published some papers. I was really lucky. The Chuck Matthews was the editor in chief of the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, and I sent him this bizarre paper on apocalyptic AI, which was not out of my dissertation. It was kind of inspired by what I wrote in my dissertation. And Chuck thought it was interesting enough to be worth sending to peer review. He could have very easily been like, what a weird paper. No, desk reject, right? And the peer reviewers were gracious enough to like the paper, right? And so then when I pitched to Oxford, the editor there emailed, because Oxford publishes the jar, they emailed the editor there, Chuck, and they said, what do you think of this guy? And so Cynthia Reed, who became my editor at Oxford, one of the most brilliant, wonderful lunch partners you could ever have in your life because she's so smart and she was reading everything, she emailed Chuck and he said, well, I think this is kind of smart. And she said, okay, all right, kids, send me your book. And so I sent this book I had written, which I had written without, the proposal came after I wrote a book, right? And again, really fortunate. Peer review worked out for me, and they published that book. But there were people doing some really cool things on robots, just in very small doses, right? People like Anna First, who a Lutheran theologian who had been at MIT in the 1990s, and
Mm,
she had been working with Rodney Brooks's lab on their robot cog and thinking about what it meant to communicate with a robot, right? At this point, and Anchi Jacqueline, another theologian who had kind of talked about it. And then there was the all important, everyone who cares anything at all about religion, science, and technology has to read David Noble's book, The Religion of Technology. I mean, everybody has to read that book. If you haven't read that book, you just got to read it. Even if you don't like
mhm.
it, you
Yeah.
read that book. So there were people who were
Yeah.
kind of talking about this thing, but nobody had kind of done a book length. What on earth is going on in the world of popular robotics and AI? And I was fortunate to, by sheer dumb luck, get into that place, right? But then over the past 15, 20 years, it's been really fun watching the explosion of new ideas in that domain. And that includes both the theological domain, people figuring out new ways of thinking, about Christian approaches to that or Buddhist approaches to that. And interestingly enough, the Buddhist approaches go back to, depending on how you want to count it goes back 100 years. But I'm going to go back 40 years to the early 1980s when Masahiro Mori wrote one page on a 240-page book. One page, he goes, in the future, a robot might become a Buddha. And
Interesting.
I was fortunate in coming across that reference and making it, part of some of my own work and helping other people understand Mori's positioning in Japanese robotics and also in this thinking that now has become widespread, right? You can go to the Kadaiji Temple in Kyoto, and they've got Mindar, this robot that they believe they assert is the representation on Earth of the Bodhisattva canon, right? So we're seeing these really noticeable things happen in 40 years since then, right? 1983 or something when Maury's book came out. But so I've gotten to watch some things that were largely ignored become relevant, which is really cool. And every once in a while, I get to pat myself on the back, right? And I'm like, oh, I was one of the early people who saw that, right? And I could be kidding myself, right? And I think that's really important to recognize. I could be kidding myself, but I still pat myself on the back anyway. And I'm like, I might be wrong, but I think I was important there, you know. And and now there are all these people who are looking at these issues from so many different cultural vantage points, so many different theological vantage points. So when you think about how stuff has changed, one of the things that I do wish, as with everybody, I do a lot of peer review. And it is frustrating to me if somebody says, I'm from religion X, and this is how we are engaging with robotics and AI or whatever. And you know what? Let's take Christianity as an example. If you're interested in Christianity and AI, and you're interested in relationality as part of the image of God, well, if you didn't go back and read Anna first, I'm going to tell you to, right? In my peer review, I'm going to say you need to go back and look at that, and you need to tell me why your position is different. Right. So sometimes I want to force new scholars to go back, position themselves with respect to the literature that does exist, right? There was actually a guy, Edmund First, Catholic, well, he was, I think, a computer scientist, but he takes a Catholic position in the 1990s to talk about religious robots, right? And so I'm like, you need to go back and you got to look at some of this stuff, right? And then tell me why your position on Imago Dei and relationality and whatever is adding to the literature, and then that's important and good and fine, right? So sometimes I do get on that hobby horse of go back, read somebody who retired 30 years ago. But it's also the explosion of new approaches is fantastically fun. I love it. And I can't keep up. Nobody can keep up. There's
No.
so much literature on AI right now that even if you wanted to keep up on religion and AI, you're probably in a full-time game, right? You're never going to write anything. You spend all your time reading. And so we all kind of arbitrarily guesswork our way through that. So if you didn't read something that I read, if you're writing a paper and you don't cite something I read 2 years ago, forgivable offense. But
Mm.
go back and
Yeah.
read on a first, right? And I'm likely to make you do that if I'm your peer reviewer. But it really is fun. I mean, we're really seeing so many different approaches to the thought. And that's been one of those really big changes over the trajectory, has been just different perspectives coming at it. I am fortunate. I think I stand by almost you asked me what I think I got right and what I think I got wrong. Totally arrogant here. I think I stand by almost everything I ever wrote.
Good.
The most
No, that's
tenuous paper I ever wrote was the one from 2006, the paper Spiritual Robots that came out in Theology and Science, another wonderful journal that's done amazing things for us thinking about religion and science stuff. Um, I was trying to compare American robotics and AI to Japanese robotics and AI and their cultural components that might lead to the different technical approaches. I had never been to Japan. I am I literally thought everybody was going to tell me I was crazy and that I would get all these criticisms saying, you're wrong, here's what's right in Japan. And that's part of how scholarship should move forward. It's okay to be wrong. I firmly expected everybody to tell me what an idiot I was because I was just reading things. That's how I came across Masahiro Mori 20 plus years ago, was
okay.
because I was working on that paper that got published in '06. And I expected everybody to tell me what an idiot I am. And actually, the vast majority of people in Japan or out of Japan who said anything about that paper were complimentary. And the only guy who was really critical of it, he wildly misunderstood the paper. I'm not naming him. I know him personally. He wildly misunderstood the paper and he criticized me for a thing I didn't do. He criticized me claiming that I had kind of Orientalized the Japanese, and that I was alleging that they had a relationship to robots that was inherent to being Japan or something, which wasn't what the paper was about at all. The paper was about how particular religious views might have an impact on particular scientific practices, right? Religious practices to
Mhm.
scientific practices. And it wasn't about whether or not anyone is pro-robot or anti-robot or whatever. And it certainly wasn't about the fact that people are like born pro-robot or something. I mean, it was, so the one person who really took me to task, I read it and I was actually kind of mad. I was like, you're criticizing the wrong thing. You made that up. I didn't say that. Why don't you criticize what I actually tried to say? I went and reread my own paper. I was like, did I say that? I went back
Yeah.
and reread. So fortunately, I feel like I didn't say what that. I hope you're now hearing my dog barking. I don't think I said what that person thought I said. And broadly speaking, I think I've been fortunate. And I don't think it's because I'm super bright. I think it's because the things I've been identifying are things that were just present in the environment. And that if you just looked at it, that you went, oh, yeah, that's a thing. People want to upload their minds into robots. That's pretty religious, right? It wasn't like I had some genius insight into the world of robotics. I just read the book and went, oh, well, that's what they're claiming. And then you do some extrapolation from there. How is this important? Does this affect? And nowadays, one of my favorite news articles I've seen in ages was an essay by Cade Metz in the New York Times. It had nothing to do with my work. It was about the library in OpenAI. And what I loved
Mhm.
about the piece is it had photographs of some of the books on their shelves. And lo and behold, there was one of Hans Moravec's books, his 1988 book, Mind Children. And, I thought to myself, I bet you Ray Kurzweil's book is on there, at least one, right? Age of Spiritual Machines and the Singularity is Near. I was like, I bet you at least one Kurzweil book's on there. And I would love to poke through that library. I'd like to slip one of my own books into that library,
Yeah.
like sneak in and put apocalyptic AI, like, and hope somebody read it. But, seeing those pictures was super fun because I thought, yes, that's what I've been seeing and been interested in is how tech culture is influenced by these ideas. And that can be really, really hard to trace. But that one photograph is a kind of brilliant documentary evidence. It wasn't even what Metz was talking about in the article. But that one photograph, I mean, how perfect that a random photograph, of course, there's an apocalyptic AI book in there. When you just
Mhm.
took one picture of the bookshelf and boom, of course, there's at least one that's going to show up.
Yeah.
So I'd love to see more of that library. If anyone out there is like a open AI, employee who wants to invite me in, I'm happy to
Yes.
come look at
Please,
your
please
library.
invite Robert. Yeah.
I will
Please
come
invite
look at your
Robert.
library and I will judge you.
Yes. Excellent. That's what academics need to do. Pass more judgment. So I actually want to just kind of touch on that briefly. Not really a question here, but I have noticed that science fiction has been at the forefront a lot lately. And it might be just the fact that such a significant portion of US market news is driven by technology companies who have CEOs that are influenced by these instances, sorry, by these texts of science fiction. But it seems to be kind of pervasive across and I guess I should add the caveat that to my horror, Tolkien's Lord of the Rings is being incited for like there they are, like they're being incited for these like frankly quite sinister companies. Like it just
Yeah,
makes me
yeah, yeah,
internally rage. But
yeah,
even a good friend of mine who's working on cybersecurity and AI is starting to actually read, and he never read fiction before, but he's starting to read science fiction because so much of what science fiction has talked about over the past 40, even 50 or
yeah,
longer
yeah.
is now relevant within cybersecurity and AI. And we're in a really strange place, I think, culturally with respect to this. And this kind of leads me to my next question, because your 2014 book, Virtually Sacred, um, in the title, it posts World of Warcraft and Second Life. And as someone who played World of Warcraft and Star Wars
Sure.
Galaxies and a number of MMORPGs and continues to play video games to this day, um, it's encouraging to see people writing about video games. And I would like to get to that book in a moment, but I would like to first ask. I'm going to posit a thesis to you, and I would like you to respond to it. Okay.
You've already, by the
Popular.
way, said like 12 things I want to respond to. So,
Okay.
but go
Okay.
for it.
Good.
Give me your
Good.
thesis.
Good. Good. Good.
Yeah.
Good. Popular culture as a whole sphere of texts, objects, etc., is looked at by the academy as a thing of that's neat, that's interesting, but it's not as serious as these things here. Would you agree with that thesis or no?
I think we're growing.
Mm.
One of the things I found really interesting 20 years ago was a biography of Philip K. Dick written by Lawrence Sutin, who's kind of the expert on Philip K. Dick. And Lawrence Sutin starts quoting Philip K. Dick and talking about how like the best philosophy is found in trash. And actually, anthropologists have sort of figured that out too, right? I mean, what much of what anthropology is looking at garbage. What's left over, what's broken, what was being used enough that it's still with us today. And of course, if you looked at our contemporary society, you learn an awful lot by digging through our garbage. And
Yeah.
we used to think about science fiction as a kind of trash genre, right? And I remember the day looked at my mom, and I think I was reflecting on the fact that she owned several Marvel superheroes movies. And I just went, my generation won culture. Like my mom now owns these superhero movies, which as a child, I loved comic books and I loved science fiction and I loved fantasy. And they were all kind of fringe marginal things, right? But what happened is so much of that became so deeply influential. And some of that influence, as you noted, is kind of pernicious. Like, hey, surveillance and mind control. I don't love that. My older son recently complained to me just a couple of months ago. He wrote me this WhatsApp complaint that he was like, I didn't want to go into adulthood in the combination of The Handmaid's Tale and Brave New World. These
Oh
books that
no.
are clearly dystopian and that almost read for some people in the 21st century like guidebooks, like, oh, that's what
Yeah.
we want to build, and the purpose of those books is like, this is a horrible thing. We don't want it, right? So we're looking at these science fiction narratives, and I think in a really interesting way. And I do think more scholars, I have in the course of my career frequently cited science fiction authors on par with the way I cite um, nonfiction authors, right? Our fellow
Interesting.
academics. There are times when I think something's really, really pertinent. And, when I look, I get to dig around and I happen to be sitting you talk about virtually sacred, this book, Snow Crash. If you want to understand virtual worlds, you have to have read this novel. Because if you haven't read this novel, then you haven't had the opportunity to know what motivated people like Philip Rosedale as he created Linden Lab, which created Second Life, right? These are important, even if you think you don't like the book or the book's trivial or something like that. Sitting right next to it is Neuromancer. Where are you without understanding this? Now, as a human being, the book next to it, those are Ursula Le Guin's Earthsea trilogy. And if you haven't read those, please go read them. They'll make you a better human being, right? Because they're amazing fantasy novels, right? So this is, the reason I'm sitting here is this is my bookshelf of things I adore and love, right? And if I tilt you upwards, you'll see this really fancy version of Neuromancer that's up there at the top, along with Alice in Wonderland, another book that
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think we all need to pay more attention to, right? Um, so so many of these books speak to what is at core that human experience, right? And that we
Yeah.
should credit for the kind of thoughtfulness that goes into them and that not only affects everyday people as they live their lives, but is an interpretation of the world we're living in. And to suppose that just because somebody has a lot of footnotes dictates whether they thought with care and rigor about the world they live in is kind of crazy. And so
Mm.
sometimes I think, our literature authors provide us with a lot of avenue, a lot of path into what's going on around us, right? And I think more people are seeing that in the way they want to understand the world around them. I think a lot more younger scholars, there was a lot of prejudice when I was young. Popular scholarship was a bad thing, right? If you wrote a
Yeah.
book that people actually read, you were a trivial scholar. I mean, that's crazy. A book that
Yeah.
people read is a good thing,
Yeah.
and a book that's readable to people is a good thing. And so sometimes some of the most thoughtful and really fabulous stuff is happening in our literary universe. And I really appreciate that unfolding. And the more often that scholars can kind of weave in contributions. I mean, I don't want to give up on really rigorously done scholarly work. But if you want to understand virtual worlds, it's not just about reading scholarly work. You have to read the kinds of science fiction and fantasy that prompted those virtual worlds. Can you really understand World of Warcraft if you don't know anything about Dungeons and Dragons? I mean, you can
Mm.
play World of Warcraft. You can love World of Warcraft. You can totally like live within World of Warcraft. But if you want to understand World of Warcraft, you also need to know a little bit about Dungeons and Dragons because that and its similar games. So part of my work is about fantasy and science fiction, but part of it is also about role-playing games, which were admittedly formative for me as a child. So when I say they're important, you should take that with a grain of salt that says, well, this guy who likes these things tells me it's important. And that's always, we have to recognize that. But when you look at the kinds of narratives and structures and games that were built, that helps you then understand how something like World of Warcraft works and all of the incredible array of games after it and the millions upon millions of people who are playing those games. There's too much history for any of us to understand, but we all, and I was fortunate to be just kind of the right age to live through a lot of it. Right? I lived through the rise of Dungeons and Dragons. I also lived through the rise of video gaming, with the Atari and the Nintendo and that kind of thing. I was part of that culture and it was fun. And I'm grateful that people see it and understand it as culture. Remember when Roger Ebert, do you remember when Roger Ebert was like, no video game could ever be art?
I do, yeah. I do remember that.
It's like he didn't know that there were people who said no photograph could ever be art. It's like he wasn't paying attention to the history of art. Art changes.
Yeah.
And
That's
Roger Ebert changed his mind. I think it was the game Flow that encouraged him to understand that a game could be artistic. But lots of games can be art, and games can be philosophy, and games can be thought. And people who are playing their way through games, much like people who are reading their way through literature, have a chance to be shaped and formed by that. And
yeah,
that's why it's all the
absolutely.
more important that we understand those things. So I think we're
Yeah.
growing. And I feel deeply privileged that I've gotten to witness a lot of that shift, both as a human being and as a scholar in my career, that we're shifting and understanding how important this stuff is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't I don't know how much stock you put into this, but the fact that popular culture makes up, hundreds of billions of dollars in of the US market every year is, I think, just a testament to just how pervasive it is, right? It's not the case that you'll ask someone about the MCU and they'll be like, "What?" At least here in North America, they'll know what it is just by proxy of living in this cultural environment. So I do agree with you that it's making a much more mainstream appearance now in the cultural generally, which is slowly transitioning into kind of an acceptance, I guess, so to speak, in the academy. I went to the PCA conference, the Popular Cultural Association
I've
conference,
been
a
to a
couple
bunch
years.
of different conferences.
Yeah, I went to the one in DC, which I think was in 2018, and I was shocked. There was a lot of people, thousands of people actually. It was big. Like it was nowhere near AAR, but it was big, and it was impressive. There was a lot of interesting scholarship going on there. So it's really good that you've witnessed this change across your career, and I think um, I think it's important too that a voice like yours is represented in ISSR, because I think that's where some of the most interesting um, discussions on science and religion are happening, are in popular culture, um,
Yeah.
and
Yeah, because people are wrestling with the realities they live in, you know,
exactly, yeah,
and sometimes. what we don't recognize is that let's go back to India as an example. The Ramayana, once upon a time, was popular culture. It was stories and plays shared with people. And then it became, what we now call sacred text, but it still operates in popular culture in a variety of ways. And when we look at what we see as popular culture, as you said early a moment ago, you were like, don't people tend to dismiss it? And they often do. And they often dismiss it in a way that they don't really recognize that many of the treasured artifacts of our kind of textual history were once upon a time just some version of pop culture. And that's
Mm,
okay. You don't
mhm,
you don't need to give it more weight than that because it's already fascinating. If a thing is so compelling that people are living their lives by it, then that's really, really interesting. And we should want to understand that. And we should also want the popular culture then to be produced in the best possible ways, right? If you think about video game culture or something, no, I am not advocating censoring out Grand Theft Auto or something, even though it's a game I've never played. But, there will always be a place for people to play games where they run over people or whatever. It's fine. But you also want games that challenge people to think. And so many
yeah,
game designers, way back, 10 years ago and more, when I was interested in the kind of game studies universe, I got a chance to talk to some game designers, did some consulting work with Electronic Arts, and the game designers were super thoughtful. And they were very
yeah.
interested in what they were producing and both how it reflected culture and how it might impact their players. And so that's really important stuff. And that's something that nobody really, you go back to sort of the history of modern, RPG gaming around kind of Dungeons and Dragons or whatever. I don't think if you could go back to Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson and that crowd in 1976 and say, hey, are you really reflecting on human society? And are you aware of how you're going to change human beings? It would have been like, dude, we're just trying to roll dice and play a game. We're having fun together. But I think actually game designers are way more alert to this
Mm.
in the present era where, yes, they want to make a thing where people roll dice and or push buttons, and have fun, but that it also tons and tons of it is not just fun, but it's also super thoughtful fun. And they realize that even people accidentally making thoughtful fun, right? That so much of the fun was thoughtful, uh, purely, arbitrarily because it's who we are as human beings, right? And now we're trying to maybe sometimes sneak a little thoughtfulness in. And I love that when game designers want to do that kind of thing, even though I remain my video game universe is at its best with 8-bit. Um, I between you and me, if we sat down to an original Nintendo game, I'm probably going to win every one of them. But if we sat down to anything with like 8 buttons on the remote, you're going to win every one of them. I'm
Okay.
like not capable of controlling,
Yeah.
modern video games, which my children find hilarious. But the old games they can't beat me at. I'm like, well, you can press 10 buttons. You can't beat me at a 2-button game.
Yeah,
But they
for
can.
sure. That is interesting. Yeah. Just a little aside here. My brother had a baby and he's talking to me because we one of the things that we connect on is video games. So he was talking to me. He's like, I gotta take him back and play Super Nintendo games. I'm like, no, dude, you gotta start at Nintendo games or earlier if you want. You gotta give him the whole lineage of these things. It really makes you appreciate the where they came from. I think that's important.
And I'll note, by the way, that one of my absolute favorite original Nintendo games, which was so hard at the time, but now games have become, the challenge level is so different that you probably go back and be like, that's cake. But at the time, one of the hardest games, kind of a lot of us knew on the original Nintendo, was the game Ninja Gaiden or Ninja Gaiden. I don't know how
Oh
you.
yeah, Ninja Gaiden. Yeah, yeah,
It's been a long tradition. There's been a whole bunch of additional games.
yeah.
The opening, Act One, Scene One, takes place in Galesburg, Illinois, where I live now.
No
It
way.
doesn't it doesn't look like it at all, but canonically, if you go look Canonically, it takes place in Galesburg. It has absolutely no relation to the actual appearance of our town. And one of the things that I keep wanting to find the time to do is dredge up who were the game designers, talk to these people in Japan, try to figure out if any of them were ever here, because Knox actually has a long history of international students going back to, I think, could be wrong, I think the very first Japanese, I think our one of the, I'm probably wrong. I thought the first international Japanese student to an undergraduate institution to the United States in the early 20th century might have been at Knox. But that's
Interesting.
probably
Wow.
saying too much. But we definitely did have an early history. 100 years ago, we had students coming from Japan. And so, of course, in the 1980s, we had students who had come from Japan. And I'm wondering if whoever the heck designed that game, one of those people, I'm wondering if they're a Knox grad, which would be
Yeah,
super fun. And then I would want to
that would
invite them to
be.
campus and come talk about their Knox
Yeah,
experience and video game design and whatever else, you know.
absolutely. That'd be amazing. And also just a really kind of cool little pin on the Knox College list of achievements.
I told my students just because I only learned relatively recently, a few months ago, and I told my students this winter, and they just were like, "What? You know, what are you talking about?" Of course, they also don't know the original Nintendo game, but yeah, they were quite surprised. We
Yeah,
need to
yeah,
pin that up all over campus.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. That'd be I mean, Ninja Gaiden's just such a staple. I think a new one just came out last year. Um,
Probably. But that old, if you haven't played the old original NES game, that's a really, really fun game. And at the time was very, very challenging. It was one of those games you just left the Nintendo running because you had to go to bed. And there's no way until you got really good at it, you couldn't beat it in one sitting. You were gonna, because when you lose at the three final bosses, at any of those final bosses, you go back to the beginning of level six or whatever, and then you have to fight
yeah,
your way back up. And yeah, it
yeah.
was it was very fun and very challenging at the time.
Well, I could talk about video games for a long time, but unfortunately, we're getting close to the end here, and I do want to talk about your most recent book, Future Proofing Humanity. So, just just generally talk about the motivations going into this book, and yeah, just yeah, what was going on, what were the space you were in, and where did it go?
A couple of different things brought me into that place. One of those things was that I wanted to teach a new and weird class. And I called that class Future Proofing Humanity because we were seeing culturally this conversation around existential risk. Oh, all of humanity could become extinct, which was a relatively new idea for humanity, right? So I created a class around that. And we talked about biotechnology and we talked about AI and we talked about space flight, as these possible ways that we were going to overcome. This was the religion of existential risk. These were the people who thought we were going to use technology as a form of salvation to save individual human beings and the species of humanity. At the same time, I think I have shifted as a human into, for better or for worse, I'm not going to judge, something more of a moral philosopher than I was at the beginning of my career. When I wrote Apocalyptic AI, I was trying to understand what people were doing. So if you told me you were going to upload your mind into a robot and live forever, fine. Talk to me about it. I just want to understand. Whether I believed you or not is less the question. One of the things I've witnessed is we've, entered this kind of Silicon Valley technocratic era is so much of it worries me. I'm not comfortable with it. And it's
Sure.
not that I'm not comfortable with the technologies. I'm not comfortable with how the people in control of the technologies are treating other human beings. That's what I'm not uncomfortable. That's what I'm not comfortable with. And that's in a huge array of domains. You look at AI, and that's everything from, bias in the systems to how we treat people who are part of the reinforcement learning process to how the technology affects the end user. Like it's all of it. It worries me. And I also worry that the people who are in charge of those systems are doing nothing but profiting at the loss of a lot of people culturally and all around the globe. And so I become more of a moral philosopher than I ever anticipated becoming. These things worry me. Combined with intellectually, I'm like, well, there's this crazy religion and technology that I've always been talking about, and that's always just been interesting to me. Whether it's true or false was never relevant. It was never, I've never been really worked up about whether people would upload their minds into robots. It just strikes me as interesting. And when those two things kind of came together in teaching the class at my previous institution, taught this class, Future Proofing Humanity. And at the time, we were just trying to understand the religion of it all. And then it went through a few different iterations. And I sort of thought, well, maybe my students would like a kind of textbook, which it turned out they didn't. They preferred, I asked them, I was like, would you like it if I just wrote this up as a textbook as opposed to giving you all these different, sometimes opaque primary sources? And my students were like, no, wrestling with this stuff is worthwhile and good. So that's to their
Interesting.
credit. That's a really good thing. But then what ended up happening is I started thinking, well, maybe I'll write like a pop science book. And so I took everything I was doing in that class and expanded it, and that was what ended up producing the book, which is really both a kind of, it is that intellectual side of here's the religion of technology that exists, but there's also the moral side of it that says this is not the right religion. And there's perhaps a better religion of technology. And so it kind of begins with a little mythical narrative and it ends with a mythical narrative. And the idea is to say we could write a better religion of technology. I'm okay with it if your religion is about robot gods and whatever else, that's fine. I don't care. But if your religion doesn't produce good outcomes for the world around us, then I don't like it. And, I don't know if you've read Karen Howe's book, Empire of AI. That's a terrific book about open AI. And it's the kind of thing, it's just one example, but where you kind of read something like that and you think, wow, the people in charge maybe aren't the people who ought to be. That maybe we have a better way to do this. And so many people, there's a guy that I really respect and like. His position is as long as human beings get to space, that's a good thing, and he doesn't care how we get there. And my position is it's a good thing if human beings can get into space. That's lovely. But if we get there only in oppressive, terrible ways, then that's not good, right? That the
Mm.
only good reason for human beings to be in space is that we've really allowed the best part of ourselves to drive that. And so future-proofing humanity became this sort of simultaneous exploration of what people were thinking and a kind of critical evaluation that says, that's probably not the best way. Let's try to think about a new way. And whether or not anyone will agree with the very beginning perspectives I offer for a new way, I don't know. People might figure I'm crazy. They will like, I have a copy, I think. Yeah. They'll like the cover art. The cover art's awesome.
Yeah, explain that to me.
I had the cover done by a really tremendous guy. His name is Richard Borge. He does illustrations for the New York Times and um, Wall Street Journal. He's really a terrific guy. And we had this whole back and forth process about, well, what happens if people are trying to flee Earth, And so you can see, if you look really close up, there's this like asteroid and it's coming for the Earth, right? And then this little spaceship with a kind of like, maybe he's a robot, maybe it's a robot, maybe it's a human being in a spacesuit. It's not really clear.
Yeah.
But it's like flying away. And and Richard actually made me an animated version, which I put up on social media all the time, where the little helicopter spaceship is flying away as the asteroid's coming toward Earth.
Oh
It's
no.
fabulous. I just love it. And the idea was really that we do live in an era where existential risk is real, and we can't ignore it. We literally cannot ignore it. We know there are geological forces that could kill all of humanity, cosmological forces that could kill all of humanity, and most likely of all, human beings will kill all of humanity. either through runaway climate change or nuclear war or any of the many bioengineered super viruses, we're a threat to ourselves.
Yeah.
But we do live in an era where you cannot question that we are at risk. And so that's true. And then the question is, what do we do when we accept that reality? Do we just put our technocratic elite in charge of solving that? I mean, I'm pretty dubious of people who own bunkers in New Zealand looking out for my personal interests, much less
Yeah.
the interests of people who are less fortunate than I, right? I'm in a pretty privileged place. I have a lovely home, and I'm not particularly worried about war reaching, where I'm, riding my bicycle to work every day or whatever. But there are people of the world who are at risk of all these things, and we really have to figure out solutions. And so future-proofing humanity very much became, it wasn't originally it was just about the religion of technology in a different kind of avenue. And it became we need to tell a different story. We need to tell a story about technology and humanity that inspires us toward our best. And ultimately, I hope other people will join that conversation and think about what they can contribute to a public conversation that helps us be the best of ourselves. Because I'm
I
not
have a
creating
lot
this
more to,
narrative.
yeah, I have a lot more to say about that, especially when it comes to forging forging new kind of grand narratives about important important and pervasive matters that we all have a hand in. Whether that be technology or our politics or what say you. But I feel like that is probably an entirely different conversation on the pervasive role of narrative in shaping our cultural and social environments. So I think right there I'll probably pause if that's okay with you. We'll put a bookmark and maybe return to
You're the
this
boss man.
later. But I would like to thank you so much, Robert. And I would just like to say that your book is out now, correct?
It is out now, available
Soft
at all
cover.
normal opportunities.
Yeah, paperback was released on January 15th, so it's now available in a more malleable format, which
Yeah.
is great.
Yep.
So yeah, that's available on all major resellers. So yeah, if you're interested about anything you've heard here today, make sure you check out that book. But thank you so much, Robert, for
Thank you for
spending your
inviting me.
time with us today. And I hope you got something from that. I know I sure did. And I wish you all the best
Thank you so
in your
much.
future
Thank
work.
you for inviting me, Anthony. It's really a joy.
So, just one final little after credits cameo. You wanted to tell us something, Robert. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I didn't have a clever way to slip it in, didn't occur to me, but I dream of a social media empire, and I am not a social media guy. If you look for me on Twitter, I post rarely and it's fairly useless. But I'm creating a new account and it'll be on Instagram, maybe TikTok, I don't know where else. It's called Myth, Monsters, and Tech. And what we'll talk about are all the things that I think are fun in the world. Anything from Dungeons and Dragons. I literally filmed myself, even though this was just in advance. I filmed myself doing an unboxing because I know unboxing is cool. So I ordered a 1976 version of the basic Dungeons and Dragons book, Gods, Demigods, and Heroes, which was the prelude to Deities and Demigods, which was really influential to me as a human being. I wrote a whole blog post about it. But so I did an unboxing video of that. So I'll do unboxing videos when I buy cool and interesting things, and I'll do photographs that I take in out in the world of public sculptures of monsters, mythical monsters, and that kind of thing. And I'll talk about technology, about AI and virtual worlds and whatever else, all as part of what I hope will be a fun conversation for people to just sort of engage with a little bit with things that I happen to think are fun and interesting.
Yeah, great. That sounds really exciting. And I think it's important too to always point to the way that the mythic is actually much more embedded within our culture than first appearances may
Yeah,
give
I mean,
us
there's
thought to.
reasons I'm covered with cave paintings, right? Like that's what my tattoos are all cave paintings, except for the ones on my chest, which are cave paintings of mythical monsters that I had my tattoo artist produce for me.
Awesome.
But I think all of it is about that mythical root of how we see enchantment in the world, how we develop meaning, and so forth. And so, in some sense, the whole social media empire, which will have like one follower, my social media empire, will about that mythic story we're all trying to tell.
I've listened to a number of videos and each one has pronounced your name differently. So, so I, so maybe I'll actually leave this in, but for the record, what is the proper pronunciation of your last name?
Well, the proper pronunciation involves hand waving and an Italian Geraci,
Okay, it's
right? But
Italian. Okay, that's
I usually go by Geraci, but I'm comfortable with a wide array of possible options.